Hello, and welcome to the Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth, and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larson.
David.
Hello.
Thanks for joining me.
Thanks.
How are you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
Good. Yeah, really good. Thank you.
Good.
Really good. Really good. I'm going to ask you a question to hold in your mind for the end of the podcast that we'll come back to.
Okay.
So is the planning system fit for purpose? So it's a pointed question.
Thanks for
let's circle round it and we'll come back to it.
We've only got an hour, haven't we? Is that what you said?
We've got an hour. No, exactly. But before we dive into it, David, why don't you just give a brief introduction to yourself and
Sure. Okay.
go from there.
So I'm David Morris, a board director here at DP9. As many people will know, DP9 is a independent planning consultancy. 20th year this year, and we're pretty blessed in terms of being independent. We do one thing, planning. On a good day, we're okay at it, and we largely do it in one geography, which is London, and London in its sort of wider context. Increasingly new geographies, but the business is built out of relationships. And sort of and repeat business, which I think some people look at it and say, oh, that's quite interesting. How's that come about? But when you actually look at the task of being a planning consultant, a lot of it is about relationships and about finding shared opportunities, shared solutions. So and that doesn't come overnight. You know, that's born out of trust and things. So that's what we do. I guess I'm the product of DP9. I don't know what number I am. I'm not 10. I'm a bit beyond that. But I naively left university and I studied geography, which is what you do when you don't know what you want to do in life. And then this was around the Prescott era when they were trying to get people into planning. And I did a master's at UCL. And I was doing some work at the time, actually for Andy Hunt and Tom Dobson. We're not allowed to talk about them because they're competitors. And I said, I'm not really up for this sort of socioeconomic number crunching thing. What do you recommend? And they said you should go and have a chat with a guy called Malcolm. He's just set up this business. So I trotted along and kept me waiting 4 hours, I think, for an interview. The interview was in a cab on the way to a meeting. I was kicked out the other end and told to come to work the next day, which I did, and I'm still here. So, and I sit on the board with, there are 13 of us that co-own the business, it's a fun place to be.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned relationships there, and I firsthand know the value of the long-term relationships, with yourselves and what that can bring to the process of building and developing buildings in the built environment. But so what have you learned then since that cab journey about the planning system, the role of a planning consultant, your position in the whole built environment industry, and kind of what that entails?
So, I mean, I think the first thing to say is planning is a very nebulous term, isn't it? And it actually encompasses lots of things. And I think it's important to say, we do a very, very specific piece of planning, which is effectively acting for private clients to go through the process of obtaining a planning permission. There's a whole bunch of work that comes before that around policy and master planning and everything else. And whilst we kind of assist in that, that's less of our lead. And I think the thing that I've learned about it, and I, as I said, it's probably come from a very naive perspective, is you can't, particularly on the type of projects we do, it's a bit corny, but it is a team. You can't, we're not magicians, neither is an architect, neither is everybody, and actually it's as much about how you work with other people within your team and how you work with the local authority, GLA, etc. So I think kind of having, and sometimes we're known, I think, unfairly for being a bit too commercial and I think that's something which, because or in the day-to-day of what we do, we don't spend enough time educating people on how we are. But if you're very aggressive in the world that we're in, you don't get very far, because you have to achieve things through consensus. And 9 times out of 10, actually, there's a lot of commonality between a commercial brief and what a public authority audience want. It's rarely that you actually do fall out. But I think at the heart of it is sort of the way you operate with other people, and at the core of that is listening. It's a really important skill, and it's something that we really try and embed in people from the very start when they come here, which is you've got to be able to listen and understand a different perspective, even if you don't agree with it. Because from that will come some kind of consensus and a way forward. And it's not a very nice phrase, but sometimes planning is a forum within which sort of conflict resolution occurs, right? How many times have you sat with somebody and they fundamentally don't agree with what you're trying to do? And this concept of disagreeing agreeably, I think, is really important.
Yeah. So it's all really kind of the human things that you're mentioning there, about consensus, about listening, and I think that's so vital, isn't it, to where we are as an industry and what we kind of need looking forwards as well. And because you are sat in your role, particularly, between effectively what to a layperson would look like a legal document in terms of planning policy. Sure. The language, everything about it is really binary and not very human in a lot of ways in terms of policy X, Y, and Z. And then you've got developers, designers, and then the broader industry, but much beyond that, obviously, is the communities and the places in which we're sort of operating. And your role is to sit within all of that, isn't it? And sort of you're not just listening to the industry, you're really listening to the public and to the people in the communities and the places that you're operating. Yeah,
and our clients. There's a kind of, I think sometimes there isn't an honesty to why we're all in the room, which is that you have to drive commercial outcomes. But I think, as I say, 9 times out of 10, the commercial outcomes are actually aligned with other priorities. And I think we've come a long way as an industry to recognizing other metrics to value development other than just profit and money, right? But that is a core point. And I think the policy environment is really important. But I think, and I know we're going to talk about this later, that one of I think one of the lazy sort of statements that politicians put out is, planning needs completely reforming. And I don't think it does, because actually it works very well on a good day and it works very unwell on a bad day. And it's about how it's applied. So, a lot of the policies are deliberately vague because it's kind of recognizing that any given location is going to need a different response. And if it was one size fits all, we'd live in a very different place. The zonal system in New York, for example, that works because of what New York is. It wouldn't work here. And it allows people to, because there are some vagaries intentionally within the policy environment, to shape strategies and outcomes accordingly. But that's our job, because we wouldn't be doing our job if we just said, there's a policy, you can read it yourself. They are, they're quite chunky documents these days, but a layperson can sit down and read them and get a basic understanding. How you apply it, how you take people on that journey through the planning process, that's really our job, and that's about relationships.
Yeah, really interesting. And you mentioned commerciality there a few times, and we as a developer, it's fundamental to what we do as well. And if you're of a mindset that growth is a good thing, places can change, places can grow, the only way that really happens is if they stack up commercially. And you've got to have some form of basis that allows these things to happen. I don't think many people in our roles enjoy the projects that don't go off the drawing board. We all want to be involved in things that are realised and that have a kind of transformational impact on places and on people's lives. And the only way that can really happen is if they stack up. So I think it's it's right that we are all first and foremost very mindful of the commercial realities of a project, whether that's from the client's perspective, whether that's a local authority's perspective, but then, as you say, kind of this sort of broader notion of value and what does that kind of mean and how does that relate to people's lives is really an interesting sort of aspect, I think, of what we do. And maybe that, if we do sort of cast ourselves forward to projects that are maybe on the drawing board now and that are going to be realised over the next 5-10 years, that broader sense of value is really important, isn't it? And it's factoring into the planning at a really early stage now, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think there's, as I said before, I think we as an industry have come quite a long way, and I think it's fair to say that narrative you've just given now is probably more commonplace across a fair spectrum of private clients, private developers. I think if you wound back 10 years, there wouldn't be many people talking in the way you are. Mm-hmm. And I say that because I think one of the problems, opportunities, is relationships between the public and private sector. I feel really strongly about this. I used to teach a course where it's all about the history of planning and where it's come from. And it's really interesting. If you actually look where planning started, in its modern format after 45 with the Attlee government, and you look at what it was trying to do and you compare it to what it's become, it's really interesting. And the fact that it's only very recently that planning departments stopped being called development control and started being called development management, I find that fascinating, because the inference is you want to control development. And people will have different views on that. But I think there's a kind of, I think they call it epistemology, don't they? That your thought process and natural psyche approaching an issue. And I think for too long, there's been a bit of this, right? Which is like, you're a big bad ugly developer and all you want to do is make money. And we're here to represent communities and deliver the best outcome for our borough, for the people that elect us, whatever it might be. And the truth is, nowhere, it's probably somewhere in the middle, right? Depending on the situation. But neither of those two scenarios are fair. And I think the whole conversation needs to be recast. But that's very difficult, very, very difficult, particularly in an age of populism, which is where we live in, right? Without getting too political, that there's a fundamental problem that says if you collaborate and talk to the private sector with somehow collaboration can become collusion. That's not the case. And the best outcomes, I believe, having been in this business for 20 years, have been when there's been open, honest, and frank conversations between local authorities, the Greater London Authority, and the development community. Because 9 times out of 10, I keep saying it, you can always shape a strategy as a developer to meet the objectives of the local authority if you know what they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's finding common ground, isn't it, within aspirations. And there's always going to be difference of opinion, and there will be different perspectives, and that's right. Yeah. But there will, as you say, there's also a lot of common ground there, and people want to see things happen. I think fundamentally, a lot of people, want things to move on, to improve, to change. But there's aspects within that, aren't there, that is about how, as you've said, how do you listen, how do you build consensus, how do you communicate that, and how do you create a process where it feels like there's an element of kind of trust, collaboration, these words kind of get thrown around, but actually there's kind of consensus, as you're saying, is probably a better word for that. It's that there's an aspect of, okay, we understand that there's some drivers here. We maybe don't agree with them all, but can we kind of join some consensus around some of these issues?
Yeah, and I think, a big issue is, look, we're not perfect, right? No, people will say to us all the time, well, I'll point to a project where I feel like you didn't listen. And I think I'm talking about the process. Yeah. And you know what, local authorities are really good and quite rightly at pushing developers to say, you should engage early, you should listen early, because it's in your benefit. Because if you bring these people with you, you will always find friends that will want to support what you're doing. You'll always find people that aren't on board or don't like what you're doing. You know, and I think a kind of positive look back to inform where we might go is really important. You know, what did we do well historically? What did we not do well? I think many people would say the way we've consulted on what we might call the sort of more medium to smaller projects, you know, your big King's Crosses of this world, that, you know, there's traditionally, in my view, been a bit of a different psyche. But more and more, this kind of thoughtfulness and realization that actually to undertake this process properly is going to get you a better commercial outcome, and linking those two things is quite a new phenomenon.
Yeah, definitely. And how much in what we do and in the built environment do you think is planned? Can we plan in that broader sense? And how much is serendipitous about whether that's in the process or whether that's in the outcomes in terms of what is actually being drawn, consented, and then built?
Well, look, I'm not unbiased in this, right? I mean, I think it's an incredibly tall order for a local authority to write a document, which in itself takes probably 3 years to write, go through the process, that's going to set out a plan and a stall for the next 10 years, right? So if you were to rewind 10 years from now, every single plan that's been written is now redundant. Post-COVID, Brexit, you name it, health of the high street. And I think the unintended consequence sometimes of policy is that it becomes too much of a ring fence for practitioners like me and you know, planning officers that would kind of say quite sensible things like, well, we agree really you know, there isn't an office market here, but I've got a policy that was written 7 years ago that says we shouldn't lose office. So but you know, in lieu of a better system, and I don't think there is one, as I said earlier, I think it's about the way you use these policies, and I think more discretion to planning authorities, planning officers, leaders of councils to sort of say, we've read our plan in the round, and actually our priority here is X, and we'll consume with and treat with this policy, but we're not going to meet it because we're trying to achieve this, is important. And there have been some key decisions like Master Brewer, which kind of dealt with this whole tall buildings D9 issue, where authorities have set out their strategic priorities. If you're going to adopt that approach, which is to say plans will never keep up with reality because reality moves a lot quicker than plans do, you have to have a very clear set of objectives and a clear leadership team that are going to implement those objectives. And I think that's, if I was going to offer some positive criticism to the public sector, that's sometimes where this falls down. And that's not that is positive criticism in the sense of that's no one's fault. And I think an inherent issue within planning and policy is the influence of politics, quite rightly. You know, we live in a democracy, and you know, these plans are led by political objectives. But if we've got a plan for 10 years that doesn't always keep in touch with reality, we have an election every 4 years with new ideas and new people. So there's a lot going on at any given time, and that's the world that I live in when I'm sitting down with you saying, right, okay, what should we do on this site? What are the priorities? And the wider thing in all of this is certainty, isn't it? I mean, you know, you buy a piece of land, you go through all the normal things. If it's a reasonable size scheme, it's probably 12 months, if not 18 months of talking and pre-app before you lodge your application. So it's 2 years. Well, a lot can happen in 2 years. And you kind of want to know that on day one, what you're trying to achieve is going to still be there at the end. And I think that commitment from leaders to sort of say, yes, what you're trying to do meets our objectives and we're with you. Doesn't mean we're not going to give you a hard time and we're going to push you and we're going to sort of get the best outcome for us. That's their job. That's what they should do. But we're not going to fundamentally pull the rug from beneath you. And I'm not saying that people wake up in the morning and do that. They don't. But the world can change around you, and then the circumstances can. And, you know, these decisions that developers make, that, you know, this is big money. So I think I do firmly believe that it's how we are using the planning system, not the planning system itself.
Mm. Yeah, really interesting. And you know, themes around kind of like leadership and vision are quite important in this, aren't they?
Yeah.
In terms of, as you say, taking that sort of slightly longer term perspective on things. And if you look at successful places, successful cities, they are flexible. They are able to adapt.
Yeah.
You know, places that are one use 100 years ago can be some of the most valuable and relevant places today, even though they weren't designed for a certain use or a certain pattern that they're now occupied as. And that's a real strength, isn't it, of good places, is that there is a set of principles maybe there's a set of kind of ideals there, but they're loose enough that they actually are able to kind of adapt and change to life and to people and to what happens in places, and taking that sort of slightly longer term view and longer term vision, but then allowing things to actually happen. It's quite an interesting aspect of the process, really.
Well, and reacting to the circumstances of the day. I mean, you know, just to frame that, a good example, I think, is, you know, look at what the City of London are doing at the moment with office buildings. They're kind of saying, we recognise that the office market, the way we use offices, the way we work has fundamentally changed. We don't believe it's going to go back. And we're looking at our existing buildings and saying there's a lot of stock here which is never going to meet these new requirements. And then they've made a very sensible decision which says, well, the only way we're going to get better offices on those sites is to knock them down. And actually, if we think about our strategic priorities, there's a big carbon debate going on. Can we not repurpose those buildings for something else? That's, you know, they haven't changed any policies. They've just approached things differently.
Yeah.
And you know, the reality is that has come from strong leadership that has said, we've got problem coming here. Let's kind of react and change the way we are, or consciously, no, we're going to ride it out, which is also fine. You know, we don't think it's a long-term thing. We think it will come back, which is what some boroughs have done. But the point is, there's a consistency of thought which is there for the longer term.
Mm.
That's the key thing, because people value long-term commitments, because by its very nature, that's what we are. That's what we're doing. You buy a site and you're talking to the local community. You're talking about something which is what, 5-6 years away. It's a long time, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned earlier the difference between, you know, planning, development, management, and planning, development, control.
Yeah.
And what you've kind of just given there is that kind of, you know, example of where it's about management. It's sort of a active rather than reactive aspect, and there's a lot of opportunity that can kind of come from that for places, whether you're talking about public or private sector. It's just for places, you know, generally.
And the interesting you're right. But the interesting thing that I think, if we're gonna think about where we've gone and where we're going, I don't think we do enough to set out, it's a horrible phrase, but the kind of the KPIs of any given scheme, right? You know, if you're a local leader, or if you're the head of planning somewhere, you know, why do you get out of bed and support and fight for a scheme? Yeah, and what do you get for it in terms of, again, credit is probably the wrong phrase, but you know, you've got to think about it through that lens, and that's why I'm really interested in the way the development community has moved, because I think there's a lot of alignment around issues of place, inclusivity, investment in public realm, etc., which are completely aligned with the kind of metrics that local authorities care about. But I don't think we're very good at actually, at the end of a project, kind of playing that all back and saying, well, what did we achieve? What did we not achieve? What can we learn, etc. And I think that in itself would empower this process a bit more. You know, I mean, if you're a planning officer and you're on the end of 500 objections because you've got something controversial, but you kind of believe that there's something good here that you should be supporting. It would be nice to know, well, we did it 2 years ago, and actually look at the benefits that have come. That's why we're doing it. That kind of circular feedback loop, I don't think is there enough.
Yeah, interesting. So for you personally then, David, are you a sort of strategic long-term planner in all aspects of your life, or have you kind of how do you
personally?
Yeah, how do you how have you seen yourself sort of evolve through your career, and from that sort of meeting with Malcolm in a taxi to where you are now personally?
Well, I think we're blessed, right? I mean, I believe we all work in the greatest city in the country, one of the greatest cities in the world, yeah. And if you look at the way this city has changed in the last 20 years, the kinds of developments that have come forward, the opportunities that have been there, the people you work with. I mean, I'm holding Malcolm's bag, but I'm sitting in a room with Norman Foster or Renzo. I mean, this is like, and and the vast majority of people in this business get up every day and that's what they want to do. Do I sit there and think I want to change the world? I don't think we do. I think it's more nuanced than that. But what we do and the people we work with is incredibly enjoyable. I don't know if it would be the same if I worked in a different city or whatever. I'm lucky that I don't have to think like that. But I don't think inherently, because of the position we take in the wider planning process, we are kind of reactive. You call me up, or somebody calls me up and says, I've got an opportunity. That in itself is incredibly exciting. You think, okay, what can we do? Who would we want to work with? All of these things. But I think it's more, I wouldn't say, I was about to say opportunity led, but I think it's a kind of, it's almost a case by case. Consciously or not, I think we've been very lucky in the last 20 years, maybe you make your own luck, to be involved in some of the biggest, most transformational schemes in London, and we're really proud of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for you personally, what is it about being involved in those schemes? There's the excitement, there's the connections, there's the professional side of it. But you like what really kind of brings that back for you in terms of a personal level, maybe? Yeah,
I mean, well, we don't, we talk about this a lot. We don't actually make anything, right? It's not like there's a sort of line at the end of it, something comes out and you can point to it. So actually, the end result, which we got, you can't sit there and say, I got planning permission. That's not, it's the collective now, we, as a team. But it is wonderful to walk through schemes that you've been involved in and go, wow, I remember when we decided that actually it would be better to chop a floor there and change the colour of that, And of course, in my career, it's probably only been in the latter sort of third where some of these things have become realised. Like I worked on Principal Place in Hackney, which is a Foster's scheme, and there were, and actually several other partners in the business had as well, and we've all got our connections to these developments. But when they're finished and you're walking through them, you think, that we did something good there. I think that's the tangible outcome for us. I don't think, look, the pace of life in London, the kinds of schemes you work on, that's all super exciting. But as you said earlier, we've worked on a lot of schemes that have never been built, and that's kind of feels like only half the job, right?
Yeah. That's how I feel about it as well. It's great to actually see these things kind of realised, and especially when you're invested in a place like, you spent 20 years working in London. It's nice to see that on the streets. And did you grow up here, or were you?
No, I my wider story is my father who's not with us anymore. He was very good friends with David Locke, who was his sort of leader in our field and Town and Country Planning Association and all of that. And I'd go and do some photocopying in the summer and all the rest of it as a teenager. But we lived in a village that ultimately got consumed by Milton Keynes, so that kind of town planning mantra and all that sort of stuff came from there. And yeah, I hated it as a kid. And I when I went to uni, I vowed I'd never move back, and London was where I was going to be. And of course, 20 years later, I find myself just outside Milton Keynes.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, I lived in, I lived 20s and early 30s in London. So, but wouldn't say I'm a Londoner.
Yeah. No, I had a similar path, to be honest. I grew up in Norfolk.
Yeah, okay.
In the village just outside Norwich, and yeah, and then, but all my professional life's been down here. But we're as a young family, we are slowly sort of gravitating slightly further out again to have that that balance. And it's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Because we're consumed by London. We're both passionate about it as a place. We're working here, but some of the communities we're operating in, people maybe are literally born in the same street, and grow up and live there, and maybe even sort of live their whole life in the same neighbourhood. And so how do you feel, us as an industry, but maybe speaking personally, as an outsider in that context, to a local community, when we're coming in and we're sort of coming in with the best intentions, with vision, with excitement, with creativity. How do you see that?
I mean, honestly, I think historically we've got it wrong, because there's been an assumption that what we're trying to do is a force for good. And often it's not perceived that way, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly. I mean, the estate regen is the classic, isn't it? Actually there are a lot of people that don't want estate regen because they're living in an apartment which was built in the 70s and doesn't, it compared to today's standards is oversized, and actually they're very happy. So I think the one thing that we continue to learn, and as I say, I'm keen to stress throughout this, we're not perfect, nobody's perfect, is actually you've really got to try consciously to understand your audience better than you ever have done. This concept of listening is key, because we're all humans. We're all, you can look at things objectively and say that doesn't look great, but it's very different when you live somewhere. And I think we're guilty of not really thinking about just the impact that we're delivering locally. And that's everything from crikey, I'm going to be living next to a construction site for 3 years. I'd be saying the things that people say about those sort of issues. It's completely fair. Through to, how do I feel about being in a 2-story house next to a 15-story building? Forget the kind of planning jargon and EIAs and all that stuff. Actually, this place is going to change in terms of character, and what do I feel about that? And I think that leads into probably a week-long debate about how we've done, right? I think you can find some really, really good examples of delivering positive change locally, but I think you can find some really bad examples too. And that is part of that look back. I think we're not and never will be as one as a development community, because everybody's different. But I think that kind of fragmentation of experience hasn't helped the overall perception of the development community, because everybody can find a bad example and objectively look at it and go, yeah, that wasn't great. So I think it's really, and also it's really difficult to do all of that in a way that doesn't sound condescending, right? Chat with a tie and a suit and we're going to change your life and make you better. I mean, that's obviously completely wrong. So this concept about a team, we work a lot with consultation agencies and people, and I think their whole world has got a lot more thoughtful about how you can genuinely engage with people and understand their priorities and talk to them about what really does matter. And I keep saying it throughout this, but so much of that is actually about the process and the way you engage, rather than kind of what you say and what you're trying to achieve. M25 is a great example. Robert Peston did a great thing on the anniversary of the M25, and he went he found a series of sort of interviews of people objecting to the M25 when it was being built, and he went back to those villages on the anniversary and met those same people, and they all said they loved it because they could get to blue water or wherever quicker. You know, how you feel in any given moment that's not a moment cast forever, right? It's a moment in time. So it's I think it's incumbent on that process to make sure that the impacts are as good and as best as they can be, and you can genuinely look back at the end of it and say, we did something good there.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's, you know, it's a really fundamental but really difficult or tricky part of the process, isn't it? And I think that goes through everything with the system and us as operators within the system, because the planning system fundamentally is operating at two levels, isn't it? It's operating at the collective, kind of what are those big moves that we think are right for places and society based on, you know, you mentioned you study geography, everything from, you know, what are the socioeconomic shifts, what's population doing, how much housing do we need? So some of these kind of like collective things, and then as you say, what's the impact on the individual, and what does the individual need? And how does it kind of sit between those two things? And so maybe like as a kind of, you know, maybe that's maybe a nice way to kind of come back to that question that I asked you at the start, which was, you know, kind of is the system kind of fit for purpose in that? And maybe there's not one answer to that because it's trying to do so many different things.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of ways you can answer that, right? You know, do you think there's a housing crisis? Yes. Do you think we should build more homes? Yes. Do you think we should build more affordable homes? Yes. We'd like to build 500 homes next to where you are. Actually, I'm not sure. That, in essence, I think sums up the problem that we're in, which is I don't think many people disagree with what's trying to be achieved. It's how it's delivered. And the influence of politics on that specific issue, I think, is arguably unhelpful, because, you know, you make long-term commitments to places, to areas of growth in a political environment where, you know, you are arguably seeing different people every 4 years. Now, without getting sort of into all of that, because people have their own views, you know, there is a strong body of thought that says, you know, housing delivery and infrastructure growth should be apolitical. It should be based on objective facts, and there should be an independent body that sort of delivers that. And I'm not saying that's my view, but it's quite interesting when you look at, say, the way the Bank of England's run. There's no reason why that couldn't be applied to things like housing delivery. It's pretty crazy that, you know, we're sitting here today in London, there's a housing crisis. Nobody today is delivering any residential because it's not viable. And there's specific reasons for that, and it's no one given problem. But one of the largest issues that this city is facing isn't currently being tackled because of those dynamics. So I think, I keep saying it, I think that it doesn't need a huge overall sort of overhaul and transformation. I think it needs to be applied in a fair and pragmatic way, but maybe that's a romantic view, because maybe that's not possible because of the dynamics that, you know, local authorities, public sector, we all face. But I think it's I wake up every day and think it's an opportunity, not a problem. Put it like that.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely. David, really appreciate your time. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Good to chat.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.